Hello everyone and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. This channel is about my journey as a reader into the genre of fantasy. My love for this genre was rekindled at the beginning of 2023. Before that, I mainly read literature, plus an occasional thriller or science fiction novel every now and then. The fact that I now mainly read fantasy doesn't mean that my love for literature has died. I have very fond memories of many books I read in the past, and I thought, why not make content about some of my reads from the past? I will call these On the Side, because they're kind of a side dish next to my fantasy journeying. So if you're only and solely interested in fantasy and nothing else, you can skip my On the Side content. But who knows? You might also find something to your liking there. With that being said, I want to present you my first episode of On the Side. In this one, I will illustrate the immense power of fiction. I will do that by telling you something about a novel by Umberto Eco, The Prague Cemetery. This is the Dutch translation, by the way. I'm a huge fan of the novels of this Italian master, Umberto Eco. He lived from 1932 till 2016, and he only wrote 7 novels and many non-fiction books. To keep this deep dive into the subject and the novels somewhat manageable, I will leave out the many side roads, winding paths and dead-end alleys this story also has. My goal here is to illustrate the power of fiction. In this particular story, fiction plays a major role, and the power of it is blood-curdling. Literally. Before we jump in, I have to warn about spoilers. I cannot illustrate the power of fiction in this novel without giving away some elements of the story. I do not believe that it will ruin the enjoyment of this book if you haven't read it yet. On the contrary, my analysis may even help you in the understanding of this book. But if you really do not want to know anything, now's the time to close this video. Here we go. The story is set in the 19th century. The main character, the 67-year-old master forger Simone Simonini, suffers from sudden amnesia. He suspects that something terrible happened the previous day, causing him to lose his memory. More than 10 years ago, Simonini had a conversation with a remarkable doctor from Austria called Freud, F-R-O-I-D, first name Sigmund. He claimed that if you talk about your past, the traumatizing element emerges entirely on its own. So, in March of 1897, Simonini decides to start writing a diary in which he tells his life story, starting with his early childhood. By writing this diary, he hopes to find out what is the cause of his sudden amnesia. This is the diary that we read. Simonini is a grumbler, filled with hatred for about everything and everyone. Hate is the primal passion. Love? That is an abnormal condition. Hatred warms the human heart. Simonini hates Italians, or to be more precise, Piedmontese, where he was born. He likes Germans even less, and he would also like to decapitate all the French. He also hates priests. Civilization will only reach its perfection when the last stone of the last church has fallen on the last priest, and the world will be freed from that gang of thugs. There are 2 specific population groups Simonini hates even more than anything. These are the Jews and the Freemasons. His grandfather, with whom Simonini grew up in Turin, was a rabid anti-Semite. He indoctrinated his grandson with so-called truths such as Freemasons belong to a horrific cult that wants to establish a society without laws and morals. They serve Satan. This kind of indoctrination largely shaped the way of thinking of our main character. As a master forger, Simonini believes that he is not creating forgeries, but duplicates of an authentic document that has been lost or that unfortunately was never drawn up, but could or should have been drawn up. In this diary, we follow Simonini's adventures as a forger, and we witness many historical events that take place during the turbulent 19th century. We experience revolutions, intrigues, and conspiracies, and we see countless historical figures passing by, politicians, writers, and riffraff. Simonini learns from a fairly young age that people are afraid of the conspiracy of some dark enemy. It is a mold that you can fill in at your own discretion, each to his own conspiracy. Because no one assumes that his misfortune can be attributed to his own inability, he will want to identify someone to blame. Someone close to him suspects that the Jesuits, another group that our forger hates, are still active under a different name or in the guise of a different order. Simonini receives a request from someone to gauge their mood and what their plans are. That request blossoms like a seed in Simonini's brain. Instead of actually investigating where the Jesuits are and what they're doing, he makes it up. Once a master forger in everything. From his imagination sprouts the story that the people he hates so much regularly meet at the Jewish cemetery in Prague. During those meetings, they are dressed as rabbis. Simonini invents that the Jesuits at the cemetery are cooking up a plot that should lead to their world power. Simonini creates an authentic-looking document which gives his fabrication the appearance of a truthful report from an eyewitness. This document is the pivot around which this entire novel by Eco and the wanderings of Simonini revolve. He regularly adapts, refines, and expands the document. After a number of versions, the Jesuits turn into real Jews. The rabbi's garb is no longer a disguise. Gradually, more and more contrivances that are incriminating for the Jews are added to this fictional description. The bizarre thing is that as this fictional document grows, Simonini increasingly believes in the authenticity of those meetings at the Prague Cemetery. His own imagination becomes reality for him. The more he perfects his account of that fictional meeting of rabbis, the more his rage against the Jews grows. Really, you should have been there that night in the cemetery in Prague, darn it! Or at least read my testimony of that event to understand that this damned race could no longer be tolerated to poison our lives. His document of the Jewish meeting where the plot against the world is hatched is in great demand among all those people who are unable to face their own inadequacies. Ultimately, it is even plagiarized in Biarritz, a trilogy by the novelist Goethe, who published under the name Sir John Ratcliffe. The core of this story revolves around the permanent threat of three evil forces that viciously dominate the world, namely the Freemasons, the Catholics, especially the Jesuits, and, of course, the Jews. This book becomes a huge success. Simonini's creation also appears elsewhere in pamphlet form. In short, the story spreads and the audience believes that it is based upon authentic and historical material. Hardly anyone doubts that the described meetings at the Prague Cemetery actually took place. Simonini comes into contact with Leo Taxil, a charlatan and liar who, for various reasons, hates Freemasons. Taxil says, "The most important characteristic of people is that they are willing to believe anything. Without that universal gullibility, how else could the Church have survived for almost 2,000 years?" Many books and pamphlets are published under Taxil's name. detailing the wildest horror stories about the practices of Freemasons, for one. Simonini supplies Taxil with ideas from those practices. By stating that these stories have been revealed by insiders, they are given the appearance of authenticity. Ultimately, the description of the rabbis' meetings ends up in the hands of the Russians. Simonini also provides them with other accounts from so-called eyewitnesses or authentic documents that conclusively establish the Jewish plot. He calls this collection of incriminating material the Protocols. There are many more encounters, conspiracies, and intrigues in this novel in which Simonini plays an important role, but this should give you some idea. What concerns me is the following. In real life, so outside of Umberto Eco's story, in 1903 the work The Great Within the Small and Antichrist, an Imminent Political Possibility, Notes of an Orthodox Believer, was published in Russian by a certain Sergei Nilus. The final chapter of this book contains the rendering of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Nilus writes the following. A personal friend, now deceased, has given me a manuscript that describes with extraordinary precision and clarity the plan and workings of a sinister global conspiracy. This document was presented to me approximately 4 years ago with the absolute guarantee that it is the faithful translation of original documents stolen from one of the most powerful and highest leaders of Freemasonry. Nilus is convinced of this Jewish Masonic conspiracy. This work, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was translated into many languages. About 20 years later, a certain Adolf Hitler gratefully misused much of its content for his own book, Mein Kampf. Let's return to Eco's novel. This book suggests that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, from which so much misery and suffering has arisen, germinated in the hateful mind of one person. The only thing that needs to be mentioned here is that Simone Simonini is a fictional character, someone the genius mind of Umberto Eco has made up. That's right. But that's the only thing Eco invented. At the end of his novel, Eco writes a short, useless, erudite explanation. The opening sentence of this afterword reads, "The only fictional character in this novel is the main character. All the other characters that matter to the story, as well as all the mentioned and quoted publications, all the described meetings, except of course for the one at the Prague Cemetery, all the statements and performances are historical and actually existed or happened. Even Grandfather Simonini truly lived and was, as described in the novel, a rabid anti-Semite. So practically everything in this novel is the historical result of concocted backbiting in order to create an enemy. Eco's book is a warning as brilliant as it is disturbing. He shows that the conspiracy of a dark enemy can be created. History can be created out of someone's rich imagination. If the fabrications of one person fall into a rich breeding ground of dissatisfied and limited people, it can grow into a popular truth that takes generations to wear out. Let me close this video with the words of Eco himself. Now that I think about it again, Simone Simonini also existed, in a sense, although he is the result of a collage. In fact, he is still with us. Thank you very much for watching this episode of On the Side. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.